Hey, I'm Adam Lewis, and in this episode of the Deer IQ podcast, we're joined again by Dr. Andrew Little of the University of Nebraska to look at a study revealing what factors actually affect antler size. It starts to reveal what does and what doesn't, and what you can actually influence on your own. There is a debate about this and what influences antlers the most, and we start to answer that question in this episode of the Deer IQ podcast.
Welcome to Deer IQ, here to help you hunt smarter, elevate your approach, and consistently tag exceptional whitetail. Whether you're just starting out or a longtime hunter targeting mature bucks, this is your edge. We bring you proven tactics, expert insights, and unfiltered conversations with high-level hunters who just get it done. Guiding you through it all is veteran hunter and strategist Adam Lewis, helping you spot what others miss, fine-tune your focus, and unlock your full hunting potential. So let's raise your deer IQ. Here's your host, Adam Lewis.
And this episode is brought to you by our very own Deer IQ land management system. If your land is not meeting its full potential, or you're tired of seeing the neighbors shoot the bucks you're after, we can help you fix that. We measure your habitat and your hunting strategy and come up with a science-backed plan for you to grow, hold, and harvest mature bucks on your land consistently. We have a few slots left for this year, so fill out the form below or contact me through Instagram or at deeriq.com to set up your free discovery call today. Okay, and now let's get to this episode about what affects antler size and what you can actually do about it. Okay, I'm back with Dr. Andy Little. If you missed the last episode, we had a really good talk on a study that he did. He's a professor at the University of Nebraska. He's done a ton of scientific studies on white-tailed deer and other animals. But if you missed that, go back and listen to that to talk just about hunting pressure and what they found, how it actually affects deer and deer movement. But welcome back, Andy.
Yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a good talk for the last one, and we're going to get into another study here that he did today, and he's going to tell us about what they found, kind of talk us through that. And the study is, and if you want to know more about him, we went in his background a bit, but he has a bunch of degrees. Like I said, he's a doctor at University of Nebraska and also a hunter, right?
Yep.
Grew up in Pennsylvania, so he knows about high-pressure hunting, just like I do here in Michigan. But this was a real interesting study to me, and I think the application is, just to be honest, a lot of hunters want bigger bucks with bigger antlers. And this was a study on antler size and what contributes to that, right? And so the name of the study is Variation in White-tailed Deer Antler Size, the Effects of Age, Land Composition, and Physiographic Province. So, let's start here. What spurred that study? Why did you, want to do that study? What were the thoughts before the study? And what was that study set up like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this project was really birthed out of past research that folks at Mississippi State University have done. One of them, Bronson Strickland, I think you've had on before, and he did some of that work over there in Mississippi, and really understanding just statewide, and in our case, it was the state of Georgia. Can we look at harvest data that the state agency, in this case, Georgia DNR, was collecting, and understand some of the spatial variation, kind of like what, if you're up in the North Georgia mountains where it's obviously going to be very oak dominated versus down in the coastal plain, it's very pine dominated landscape. What are the potential expectations, I guess you could say, and are there certain factors that are going to affect antler size in those areas? Again, we're using data that's collected across the state at various locations. So a lot of it's just kind of drawing general patterns out of the data in relationship to land cover types out there. So again, it gives the hunters really an understanding of, if I'm trying to manage for deer in my area, are there certain factors landscape-wise that are going to influence the probability that I could have, larger antlers versus smaller antler bucks, And how do I kind of think about that when I'm, looking at the area that I'm, my property is in that I'm hunting.
Yeah, and also, how many of these, honestly, can I affect or can I not influence, right?
Yeah.
And because that's kind of important.
Oh, yeah.
Age, you talk about age, the land, you might be able to influence that some, maybe not totally.
Yep.
What is physiographic province?
Yeah, so that's the general regions of the state is, I guess, probably the simplest way to explain
Gotcha.
it. So, in our case, we had kind of there's five physiographic provinces or kind of physiographical regions of the state, and that's made up of soil type, other land cover characteristics that are in general are kind of defining those areas. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the North Georgia mountains, you get into that area and you can kind of say, well, this area tends to be dominated by certain soil types, tends to have more, dominant oak forest in this area versus down in the coastal plain where I tend to have more sandier soils. Tend to have certain, plant communities that are more adapted to that landscape. And in that particular part, the coastal plain, you tend to have a lot more pine production down in that area.
Gotcha. 'Cause that was just a big word most people probably
Oh
don't
yeah,
know. So,
sure, yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's just kind of the general idea of kind of what
yeah,
the
yeah.
physiographic provinces mean.
Gotcha. So the last study we talked about was collared bucks, right? This
Yep,
is
that's our
not
best.
collared bucks. This is
This is
from
not.
DNR harvested data, right?
That is correct. Yep, yep. So
Gotcha.
we worked a lot with the Georgia DNR and collecting data that they had. They have been collecting harvest data at processing facilities across the state. And one of the cool things was, and this is the thing I'm always an advocate for, is long-term data sets.
Hmm.
Because we typically do a lot of our studies are 2 to 3 years because that's usually the funding is available for that time frame for a graduate student. But in this case, we had data from back in 1997 up to 2016. So a lot of harvest data that was compiled. I think we had over, I believe it was like a little over 16,000 harvest records that we were able to look at, which is a lot of data that we're able to go through to look at. You had weight measurements, you had antler measurements, particularly things like circumference of the antlers, main beam length, inside spread, total number of points, things like that. Obviously, the sex and county of harvest. So then we could
Hmm.
start associating those harvest records to those different areas of the state.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a lot of data points. And
Oh yeah,
for those that maybe haven't been in a science field or taken a science class in decades or whatever it might be, typically the more data points you have, the more accuracy you get,
correct,
right? So that's a
correct.
lot of data points to weed out any outliers and things like that.
Yep.
Uh, Interesting. Okay, so I kind of have this set up here. Let's get into what you guys found. What did you see as you went through this for those factors you guys were looking at?
Yeah. So first, basically, as I mentioned earlier, each region is going to be a little different,
Mm.
and so I'll kind of give maybe just to kind of set the stage a little bit to give you some examples. So I'll kind of go back to the mountains I mentioned about earlier, North Georgia mountains, kind of comparing that to kind of the lower coastal plain area down along the coast of Georgia. You're talking cultivated crops. We quantified in that region based on national land cover data. Basically, 0.1% of that kind of North Georgia Blue Ridge physiographic region was in cultivated crops.
Mm.
0.1%, not 1%,
That's not
0.1%.
much.
It's not much, yeah. So, and then you get down to the coastal plain. We had kind of ranges between 10 to almost 20%, and so of cultivated crops in there. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a difference of those areas,
Hmm.
and you think about it, if you're a landowner in a very mountainous area and you don't have a lot of crops, the way you manage could be very different than somebody that manages that has a lot of crops. So I always
Yep.
tell people because I'm now in Nebraska and originally from Pennsylvania, when I, hunting and growing up in Pennsylvania, yes, we had row crops and where I grew up, but we had a lot of forested area. And so you would be hunting on predominantly forested tracts of land, and usually very little ag in a lot of places I hunted. Conversely, we're out here in Nebraska. you're hunting very small tracts of timber, and the vast majority is ag.
Mm,
So it's like the total opposite.
right.
And I think that's maybe a good way for folks to kind of picture, thinking about maybe their own state that they live
Yeah,
in
yeah.
is like, are there different regions of the state that tend to have more of certain things? It could be urban areas, it could be forested, it could be, whatever. Really, just kind of thinking about the landscape makeup
Yep.
in your area and is kind of going into it. That's kind of the setting the stage, I guess you could say. So in general, what we found is as you looked at, we basically broke the data out. We had 1.5-year-old bucks, then we had 2.5-year-old bucks, and then we just grouped 3.5 plus, just because sample sizes tend to be a little bit lower as you get into some of those older age brackets. So in general, what you saw, there were differences in the mean antler score. So we used a mean antler score index that was developed by Bronson Strickland and Steve Damaris at Mississippi State. We used that index using the data that we had collected from Georgia DNR to quantify kind of this antler index and looked at these different regions across the state. And so in general, what we found was our Ridge and Valley, kind of that's our along the kind of the if you're looking at the state of Georgia, so that's kind of up in your upper left corner of the state. That area for our yearling bucks was similar to some of our the mean antler score was similar to our coastal plains area. And then once you looked at the kind of the mountains and then the Piedmont, which is kind of like the more central, north central part of the state, they tended to be a little bit more similar. But then as you got going down into the 2.5-year-olds and then eventually the 3.5-year-old age bracket, you started to see some more disparity in comparisons of the regions. In particular, when you got into the 3.5-year-old plus bucks out there, the mean antler score index, we found that region, that kind of Ridge and Valley, so kind of and Blue Ridge and Piedmont. And basically what that means, like the top kind of, almost 2/3 of the state, the antler score index was very similar for those bucks. And then when you got into the upper and lower coastal plains, they tended to be, particularly the upper coastal plain was larger. You tend to see a little bit larger antler scores down there versus the lower coastal plain. Very similar to data that Bronson Strickland and others in Mississippi State have shown along some of those coastal plains areas tended to have a little lower antler score index. And basically what that means is when you're looking at this data is you as a landowner, if you have property in some of these different portions of the state, you can think about expectations. And that's one of the things I know Bronson's talked about in the past is managing expectations.
Hmm.
If I have a property maybe in the coastal plains that, I'm not necessarily going to always produce 175-inch bucks. Not saying you can't do that. You totally can. Just understand that generally there's going to be factors like soil type, the plant community and plant quality of the plant community you have out there, that's going to drive those antler sizes. And if you don't tend to have high quality soils and high quality forage, that's going to directly impact your antlers production. And obviously genetics plays at that, but we really can't manage for genetics. We can manage really for the habitat and then understand you can't necessarily fix the soil, but you can understand what expectations I may have if I have properties in these areas.
So, do you have the stats there on the difference in the antler size from the different regions? I was just curious on that.
Yeah, I don't have like the specific like quantifiable difference, but
Okay.
if we can put in if it's possible, we can put in a link. Folks can actually go
Yeah, yeah,
download
yeah.
the paper, and then they could actually look at that, and if we can quantify
Gotcha.
that for them quickly. But I'm just looking at some of my figures at the moment. You're talking, between I'll use a 3.5-year-old group there. So that upper coastal plain, the mean antler score is around 115 was the score index, and in the upper coastal plain, and the lower coastal plain was probably around maybe about 90, 95, somewhere in there. So you may say, well, that's not a dramatic difference. It was significant. Um, but it was enough that, obviously there's going to be some variation in there. You're going to have some smaller and
Hmm.
some larger, but in general, it tended to be larger in that upper versus lower coastal plain. An interesting thing is too, is in that 3.5-year-old group is that, your upper and lower coastal plains are literally, they're adjacent to each other. So basically like the coastal plain divided up in upper and then the lower. So it's kind of like upper UP versus lower UP type of
Okay.
idea.
Okay.
So,
So that's, I mean, roughly 20 inches difference.
yeah.
That I'd say that's pretty significant.
I think it's pretty significant. I think it
Yeah.
depends kind of what your expectations are, and that's where,
Yeah.
to me, when I'm looking at it, it's significant enough to me as a researcher that it's like, well, there's something going on there, and then that, because we had that, we said, okay, well then what is driving that? Like what
Yeah.
are, within those areas, and so then that's when we use the land cover data to start looking at patterns in there. Was it a function of that they had more forested cover, particularly hardwoods, or coniferous cover, more pine forest areas? They have more crops. What were those factors? And in general, trying to generalize, because every area, if people want to read the paper, they're more than welcome to, and they can get the general ideas, or more detail, I should say, ideas
Hmm.
out of there. Um, what we saw was that our antler score index for our yearling bucks was positively related to increasing coverage of our crops in the landscape, and then also suburban urban areas. So as there was more suburban urban areas on the landscape, you tend to see a little bit larger antler score index. Well, when you looked at that data, you have Atlanta, and that's in that one region of the state where you're saying, well, there's obviously a lot of urban deer that can live in those areas and do fairly well. Well, that's partly, they have a lot of different resources there that they can take advantage of, which I think drives that relationship of that antler score index for those bucks. But in kind of converse to that, what we found was when you got into the, your coniferous and your deciduous forests, your on the landscape, they tended to have a very negative effect on antler score index, except in our Ridge and Valley region of the state, where we actually saw a positive relationship to our coniferous or evergreen forested areas. But what that means to me as a manager is,
Every hunter has blind spots and weaknesses holding them back. What are yours? The Deer IQ Test 360 is our complete hunting strategy and skills assessment, designed to uncover the holes in your approach, fix them fast, and refocus your efforts on exactly what gets results. It's quick, insightful, and delivers personalized suggestions based on your unique hunter profile. If you want to consistently tag better whitetail, the Deer IQ Test 360 is where to start. Take it now, linked below or at deeriq.com.
All right, and here's your high IQ moment. It's easy to get hung up on antler size, especially when everyone seems to pedestalize those who shoot the biggest bucks. But does shooting the largest rack and posting that online really mean you're the best hunter, or change what you think a good buck is? I personally do not think so. Size is very specific to area of the country and state you're in, and 3 factors play a role: age, nutrition, and genetics. Some of the most known and interviewed, quote, experts are actually just guys that buy or lease the best land in the best areas of the country, not necessarily hunters that I would suggest taking advice from or comparing yourself to. So put it in perspective and make sure you look at the potential in your area, not someone else's. That's high IQ and something to really think about. And if you own guns and knives, you should check out our friends at 2A Display. They specialize in gun and knife displays and storage solutions that secure your weapon safely just about anywhere, so it's ready when you need it. Get 10% off when you use code IQ on your order. See that link below with the many options they have to hold and store your guns and knives. Okay, and now let's get back to the podcast.
but what that means to me as a manager is thinking about your property. So we're taking a literally like a 30,000-foot view of the
Mm-hmm.
landscape. So you're up in an airplane flying over, and that's kind of the imagery in a sense we're looking at. Now, we all know as managers that that's not necessarily that kind of landscape scale that we're always looking at. We're looking at our individual property. And so with this national land cover data set, it can give general patterns of like, oh, here's where forested and hardwood forested areas are, here's where evergreen forested areas are, but it doesn't talk to anything or doesn't speak to anything about the management of those areas. And so that's where you as a manager, you can say, okay, well, even though I may have a lot of pine trees on my property because I want to make money, I can potentially thin them out, open that canopy up, get more sunlight on the forest floor, and actually increase overall forage availability and have really, really good deer numbers. And that's what I consistently see from a lot of landowners who are in those areas where they're trying to manage for timber production, but they're also interested in the wildlife benefits. Is even though you can have some negative relationships, like our data showed, it's not necessarily taken into account the specific management on those acres. So
Interesting.
hopefully that makes sense. Kind of what I'm
Yeah,
trying
yeah. Couple of questions come to mind.
to.
First,
Sure.
when you're talking about the Atlanta area, right? So,
Yeah.
if I understood right, that is the area that generally was not as good producing, but it did around the suburban area, urban areas. Was that correct?
So it was in general, it was it was positively related to those suburban urban areas. So if there were some urban areas, the deer tended to have, from our data, yearly antler score index. So I'm just using that as one example.
Okay.
Tended to be more positively related to that.
Okay. So it wasn't just that deer maybe were getting, because if you stopped at 3.5, um,
Correct.
maybe, a lot of them are just really older, like 8-year-old bucks. But you're not
That's
saying
yeah.
it, you're saying it's not that. You're saying in general they were just bigger.
And just in general, they were
Hmm.
with that more cultivated crops in the landscape. And I'm trying to generalize across the whole state. This is not just
Yeah,
in one
yeah.
region. I'm using Atlanta as a good illustration of a suburban urban area,
Gotcha, gotcha.
but it's kind of across the whole state. When you looked at all the data, just in general, there was increasing coverage. Once you got more and more crops there, and then you had that combination with suburban urban areas, you tended to see a larger yearly antler score index. But again, when you get down into the data, you can start seeing there's nuances there, and each region is going to behave a little differently. And I think that's one of the cool things about the paper and putting this together. And it was actually an undergraduate student who came to me and said they were interested in doing a project. And so we actually built this project for them to basically put together. And so this is kind of the cool, opportunity for them to learn about how can they, take data, turn that into real world application for folks. And what
Yeah,
we share in the paper is from a hunter standpoint, wildlife manager standpoint, understand that obviously I think it's pretty universal that as the bucks are getting older, they're going to obviously get older and have larger antlers. I don't think anybody shocked by that. But that landscape composition around your area and within that general region of the state that your property is in is going to set or should set your antler size expectations. And I think that what we did here, and very similar to what Bronson and Steve and them did over there, is this is kind of a model for other states. I think that can collect this type of data, so that they can kind of help landowners think about where they're managing at, and to say, okay, well, maybe I manage in this portion of the state. Maybe I should think a little differently and maybe not expect I'm going to have 175 bunch of 175-inch bucks running around. Yes, I may have the one off, but in reality, maybe my area is just generally physiographically with soil types and habitat quality. I'm probably just not going to be able to produce as many large antler bucks as other areas. So,
right. And speaking of application, you mentioned a little bit just the land management stuff we can do. One thing I think of though is right off the bat, if I'm going to buy some property and it's, I'm really wanting it for deer hunting, I should look at where that is, right? The geographic location, it might be
yeah,
pretty basic, but it does matter.
yeah,
What is in the area, right? There's certain
yeah,
areas that are going to produce better than others. If you buy land in another area, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle and you got to manage your expectations, right?
that's
Um,
correct.
would you also say, so from this study, from this study in Georgia that if you improved your land, if it's one of those lands that are low producing, antler size wise, and you made necessary improvements, all things considered, could you potentially expect to get 20 inches better antlers? I mean, is that
Yeah, that'll be another.
unrealistic?
I'll give you that. It depends. I
Yeah,
know it's probably not what you want to hear necessarily, but it really does depend. I think that's the one challenge is trying to extrapolate results from this one study to
yeah,
other states that may have very different land cover types. I think that all I would say in general, if you are able to develop a complex of forage availability. So in our case, we'll use crops as kind of one of those things that deer were going to and crops, and we showed that in our data. That was a very positive indicator of antler size. Crops interspersed with other cover types in your area. So forested cover types. You can have open fields like pasture, old field pastures, and that you have out there. If you have those kind of interspersed in various ways on your property or in your kind of complex of maybe you and your neighbors' properties, I think in general you have a better chance of being able to produce larger antler bucks. I don't trying to give a specific number that's going to be very
right, right.
subjective. So
Yeah, there's a limit. There's a limit, and there's factors determining that. But you can do
sure.
things to maybe increase it a little
Yeah,
bit, right?
and I think that this type of, I guess, to kind of wrap all this up from my perspective from
Hmm.
the findings of these studies, like this is a good, I mentioned 30,000 foot view, and so really, like you said, it may help you as a land if you're trying to purchase land, think about those areas, the potential of properties, but also say, okay, well, even if I live in one of those areas, that doesn't mean you can't ever produce good bucks. That's not what we're trying to say. It's saying that you just need to expect that maybe you won't have potentially as many large antler bucks on those areas, but there are definitely tactics like habitat management, things like prescribed fire, timber management, that you can do as an individual or a collective group of individuals. That's one of the things I'm a big advocate of, is especially in ag landscapes like Nebraska that I'm living in now, is that you're working with your neighbors, and it's not just unless you manage thousands of acres,
Right.
which most people do not. It's a complex of all these smaller properties, 50 acres here, 150 acres here, 300 acres here, working together as a collective group to start managing those areas in a way where you can improve the overall quality of the habitat for deer through various management techniques. Then you can actually expect to have better results for your bucks that you're producing on there and your just general deer population. So
Yeah, that's a good point because, yeah, you're right. Most of us don't have that much property to influence. And it also gets away from this. And I see this a lot here in Michigan. Maybe you did in Pennsylvania too, is this competitive, like
mm,
it's me against the neighbors, right?
yeah, yeah,
In long term, that really doesn't help anybody out. If you can start
yeah.
working together, one year they might get the big buck, the next year you
Yep.
might, but looking over the decades, can you improve it in your whole area so it's better hunting for everybody? Like,
Yeah.
I think that mentality is much better and much more
Yep.
helpful.
And I think in general we tend to be, we all tend to be competitive to some level, and you want to
Yeah.
think, oh, I want to get this big monster on my property, and then you get bummed if the neighbor shoots it, and I totally get that. I'm in the same boat. And I've had many instances of that. But with all that being said, I think if from the profession as a side as a whole, I should say, the hunting profession, like thinking about how can we as good stewards of the land ensure the sustainability of our properties, not only for us, but future generations beyond us? And how can we begin to work as a community to really think about ways we can optimize that system? And like I loved your illustration there. Yeah, maybe it's this year your neighbor gets the big buck, the next year you do, but that we're happy with what we get out there, and we're enjoying the time of that relationship that we're building with the land. And no, it just takes time. That's the other thing I always tell people about conservation is you can't fix this stuff in just like one season. It takes years, and in many
Hmm.
cases, like implementing habitat management, it's going to take time. But as you do that, and you work with your neighbors, and hopefully you have some good neighbors. If you don't, I understand there's many folks out there who may not necessarily have that relationship, but if you can build those relationships, then I think that really strengthens the overall quality of that landscape. And just recognize it takes time. Like you may even have to have a conversation with your neighbor about, maybe them working together with you. It may take a decade or more, but maybe eventually that conversation is fruitful. And so that's what I think we have to kind of shoot for, is that long-term sustainability of that property. So.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I'll probably link this below, just talking about how you can kind of determine what is your, I guess, size of your property, of like, what's a good buck on my property. You can really kind of, based on studies, figure that out, right? And I think it's from maybe Missouri, where they did this study where it's like a 3.5 is about 80% of their potential.
Oh, sure.
4.5 is about 90%. So you can really just
Yep.
kind of get some data and figure that out your property and say, okay, I might be able to increase this a little bit.
Yeah.
And I have a video that goes over that, but it's a way to like set a baseline. So you're like, again,
Right.
expectations for me here. That's how you can kind of figure that out. But, well, yeah, good stuff to think about, Andy. And as we kind of wrap up here, you guys have a podcast too, talking about conservation and all this stuff. Tell us a little bit about your podcast, because some of our listeners might be interested in that as well. What is that about? Where can they find that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks. So our podcast we started about a year ago. It's called the Wild Ag Podcast. So people can go onto Apple, Spotify, really either YouTube, and watch episodes or download episodes and listen to them. But the podcast was designed. My co-host Nathan Pfluger, who is the Precision Ag Coordinator for Nebraska Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, him and I, we basically put this podcast together with the idea of bringing our ag community together and our conservation community and talking about ways that we can all work together to ensure the sustainability of our farms or ranches, not only just in Nebraska, but really beyond, because we've had downloads of our podcast across most states in the U.S. and over 12 plus countries worldwide already. And really, we just talk three themes: soil, water, and wildlife are our three themes. And so that's kind of our topic areas. And so one episode could be talking about turkeys, the next one could be talking about nitrate issues with water. But the point of it all is how can we all ensure the sustainability of our natural resources for future generations, while at the same time ensuring that producers are able to optimize their operation to feed and fuel the world. And we have to do this, and ultimately there's no cookie cutter approach. Very similar to deer management, there's no cookie cutter approach. There's some general things out there, but every property is different. And so we just talk a lot about how can we do that. And so again, folks can just go check us out: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, any other streaming devices for Wild Ag.
Very cool. Sounds like a good one. Check that out. Of course, keep listening to Deer IQ, but that's another one you can add to your queue there. Well, Dr. Andy Little, thanks again for sharing about that and just some things for hunters to think about. Okay, here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Start your own trail camera survey of age and approximate score of bucks where you hunt. Then compare this to the age antler curve I linked below to see what you're leaving on the table by age. It gives a ballpark of antler potential. There's more details to this we'll get to possibly in the future, but this is a start to determining what's possible where you hunt. Okay, next time we look at an explosive topic, the 2025 deer harvest in Michigan. What do the numbers reveal is going on? What's wrong? And our fixes on the horizon. I have 3 guests who argue their views for better hunting and deer herd management in my home state, which some think has gone completely off the rails. You won't want to miss that episode as we dig into that, and I'll see you then.